No fighting in the Ohio State-Michigan game. That's what Urban Meyer told the Buckeyes on Monday. Fighting is what the Buckeyes and Wolverines did in this game last year. We'll see what happens for the noon kickoff in Ohio Stadium on Saturday. Doug Lesmerises and Bill Landis in Ari Wasserman's car. Guys, we have to figure out if the Buckeyes and Wolverines can play with the intensity needed in this game without getting in a fight. I want to ask something different, though, first. Is Michigan good enough to make this a game? We're not Michigan experts right now. It's early in the week. Is Michigan good enough to make this competitive, Bill?
I don't think so, no.
Okay. Well, that's a preview for our picks later. I think they might be. I think, there are certain things that players and coaches say this week that they have to say. Nobody can come out and say Michigan stinks. But when the Buckeyes talked on Monday about that Michigan has good players, they just don't have good things happening. There are some good players up there. And the Buckeyes did talk about last year, Ari, you mentioned that Devin Gardner played about as well as he could play last year against Ohio State. Is it not possible, as we look at last year and wonder why that was a one-point game when these teams were in similar circumstances to what they are now? Isn't it possible Devin Gardner does that Saturday as well?
Yeah, I mean, I'm like the king of picking the 50-point game, but I think that was the most interesting thing that Michael Bennett or anybody said, I thought, about last year's game, was that Devin Gardner looked better than he ever had in any other game that he's watched on film. And when your quarterback plays at that level and it matches up with a game plan where they caught Ohio State slipping a little bit on, over pursuing and hit them on a few screens and made some big plays. And I think the most important thing, especially if you look back at some of the games that are played in Ohio Stadium, because I do think that that's a difference to be at home. Don't let them hang around early. I think Ohio State wants to start fast and make some big plays early. And I think at this point, and this is a point that you made when we were just talking before we turned the video camera on, is Michigan mentally tough enough to endure after a season of nothing but just turmoil and worry and uncertainty? Are they strong enough at this point right now to withstand Ohio State taking a big shot at them early, or will they lie down? That's a good question. I just think that right now Michigan does have some talent. They have recruited well. But I'm not necessarily sure they're in a state right now to go on the road in a year where they might not have their coach 24 hours after that game's over and win a close game. I think that Ohio State is just more likely to be in complete control, and I don't want to use the college football playoff committee term, but game control, into maybe they'll hit a few big plays, but I think Ohio State's leaps and bounds better right now.
If Michigan doesn't have the players, all this other stuff doesn't really matter that much. But we know that emotion is certainly a part of this rivalry. Bill, guys talking on Monday about the fight last year. Urban Meyer trying to make sure there's not another fight this year. Does that just happen in games like this sometimes?
Yeah, I mean, it happens. I don't know whether or not it should, but it was interesting to me after the game on Saturday. People were talking about the fight from the game last year, and the younger guys were kind of saying, I don't know what's going to happen, or using some choice words to describe what they think is going to happen. And then the older guys were saying that it can't happen. And Urban Meyer basically said he told the team on Sunday that it can't happen. Now, I don't know if that means that it won't happen because, like you said, emotions can kind of boil over in a game like this. But if Ohio State wants to play this the smart way and doesn't want to lose anybody like they did last year when they lost Marcus Hall for the Big Ten championship, they do need to keep their emotions in check. It's not like – I know you need an edge, and football players talk about getting an edge all the time, but Ohio State is leaps and bounds better than Michigan, and they don't need to come in and prove that they're tough against a team that everybody already knows they're better than. So I think if they come in and play smart, if Michigan wants to try to get something started – that's fine. Michigan doesn't really have anything to play for other than trying to ruin Ohio State's season. But Ohio State can't really get drawn into anything like that because what they have ahead of them is too important to lose a guy for a Big Ten championship game or a bowl game, whatever comes down the road.
I think this Michigan team is potentially significantly better than last year's Michigan team, though. Because last year, at this point in the season, going into that Ohio State game, Michigan was putting up not even 200 yards of offense a game. Their offensive line was a mess. And clearly things have not gone well for Michigan this year. But I feel like, it's a lot of similar pieces, and the offensive line is not as much of a problem as it was last year. I know Michigan's coming off the loss to Maryland. It's almost a point to me of if last year's Michigan team could find a way to give Ohio State a game, why couldn't this team find a way to give Ohio State a game? Because, frankly, Ohio State, We could probably sit here and debate for an hour whether last year's Ohio State team was better or this year's Ohio State team is better. They're similar. It's certainly not like this team is completely outclassing that team last year. Maybe fewer defensive deficiencies for Ohio State this year. Michigan did exploit some of those a year ago. I'm just curious to see, how much Michigan maybe does get up to play for Brady Hoke in potentially his last game, and whether or not they really do have enough talent that when that talent plays at its best, if it does play at its best, if this could be a game.
It looks like I have a black eye, which is funny because we're talking about fighting. Wasn't Michigan, the one thing I'll throw back is I think the Michigan game last year was the first sign of, oh no, Ohio State has real secondary problems. So Michigan did a very good job of exploiting an issue that Ohio State clearly had, and they recognized on film once Christian Bryant went down, but maybe they didn't play anybody good enough in the time before it for it to go detected. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. I think Ohio State played the best team on their schedule already this year, and that team would have found major flaws in Ohio State's defense. And I think the reason why Ohio State lost in the Big Ten championship game, didn't play for a national title, and almost lost to Michigan last year, was because their biggest weakness was first exploited in the game. And I'm not necessarily sure Ohio State has similar gaping holes in their defense that is going to allow Michigan to pop big plays and stay in this game. And I know that we don't want to do too much about the transitive property, but Michigan is, and I know they did last year, but has lost too many games to too many bad teams for me to think with their coach basically on his way out to come into Columbus, because playing on the road also is a factor in this, in my opinion, outshine Ohio State in the punches the Buckeyes throw early and win this game. I just can't wrap my mind around it.
Michigan has to have the talent to do it, but I do think it is interesting to see whether Michigan, after a tough year when there were expectations, maybe this is the year they break through under Brady Hoke. Instead, it looks like the end of Brady Hoke. Does Michigan pack it in? Because if they don't beat Ohio State, they're not going to a bowl. It'll be their last game of the season. Or do they try to rise up and do something, not just for their coach, but for themselves, and try to salvage this season? We'll have that and much more all week. With our coverage, of course, we'll have our outrageous predictions on Thursday, Thanksgiving. We'll have our picks on Friday. Stories galore all week. Thanks, as always, for watching. Thanks for reading here at cleveland.com. For Bill Landis, for Ari Wasserman, I'm Doug Lesmerises.